By the time she was 28 years old, she had graduated as both an architect and a planner and done that in separate settings. And she said she started a practice. She said she called it Blanche van Ginkel, architect and planner. And she had great difficulty with that because people didn't think the two went together. But what was fascinating about Blanche is that she was very involved in the spectrum of the arts and the sciences that are involved in creating cities and buildings. And she worked at all those scales and in all those ways. So she was certainly an architect, certainly a planner, partly an engineer, an anthropologist, a teacher, professor. So she was a very ambidextrous, and I admired that. And in fact, I modeled my office setup partly on that experience of meeting her and of understanding what had gone on in the world between 1900 and 1950.
Blanche had a stellar career as an urban planner. After completing her architecture degree at McGill in 1945, Blanche worked in the noted modernist planner Eugene Falludi on the first comprehensive plans for Windsor, Ontario and Regina. This is her 1946 master plan for Regina. The plan included residential expansion designed as neighborhood units and a civic center, the site for Regina's new city hall. Blanche also worked as a planner for CMHC in 1949 between her time in Le Corbusier's office and her Master of City Planning degree from Harvard. While at CMHC, she prepared the agency's handbook on urban mapping, which set the cartographic language for Canadian planning. Blanche's contribution to planning Meadowvale, west of Toronto, is not as well known as her Montreal and New York work. This area is now home to thousands of residents and employees.
From 1966 to 68, Blanche and Daniel van Ginkel, her husband, worked on the relocation of the indigenous community of South Indian Lake and its 500 peoples. At that time, it was the second largest community of the Nisichuasa Cree Nation. The proposal was part of the Nelson River hydroelectric project, which included a series of dams and hydroelectric power plants. Blanche's research in particular was led by social aspirations. So when investigated today, these materials demonstrate how Blanche and Daniel van Ginkel pushed the limits of design for the indigenous communities of the north of Canada. They show how they developed a project that constituted a strong critique of modernist models and attitudes. The proposal also displays Blanche's insistence on the significance of indigenous participation in design processes and the refusal of assessing people and cultures against stereotyped settler colonialist images of native traditions. So Blanche's research provides clues of a different and overlooked modernism that, although still operating as an instrument of state authority, they worked for the government, while it followed pioneering ideas and it presented an alternative way of practice that needs further investigation.
Seeing the work of Blanche Lemco, Sandy van Ginkel and their team, it struck me how many projects are reflecting an unusual lateral way of thinking about architecture, design and the city. A lot of the work is not architecture or planning as it is commonly understood. Even when they dealt with buildings and natural and urban environments, they would do so without relying on the conventional tools of design like plans and sections. And what I really admire is the free and conceptual way of thinking behind these works, which are not restrained by conventional assumptions of what an architect or planner should do. I believe that among the achievements of Blanche Lemco and Sandy van Ginkel, this highly conceptual approach is perhaps still a bit underappreciated. For me at least, it was one of the largest revelations while studying their archival material. It's also striking to see that the wide variety of design projects are all driven by a similar systematic logic. An illustration of this can be found in the issue of Canadian Art from 1962, which was guest edited by Blanche Lemco.
So one of the other interesting things about Blanche and Sandy's work in the Mackenzie Delta was the way in which they drew the project. For example, maybe you can see this drawing here of a plan looking at the different communities along the Mackenzie Delta and where might housing encampments for the operations of the pipeline be set up in such a way that it has the least amount of conflict with communities already there. And in the drawing, this drawing has this quality almost of a Cedric Price Potteries Think Belt. It's basically a logistical drawing studying the impact of infrastructure and looking at it both from the perspective of above and its wider regional influence, but also looking at the way in which it impacts people on the ground.
And she worked on the master plan of Expo 67, and we actually found evidence in her archives that she came up with the theme Terre des Hommes for Expo. But in my experience as an archival researcher, the thing that struck me most particularly was her work on Old Montreal, because it's very well documented in the archives, but not so much in the public domain or in the collective memory of Montreal's inhabitants. And there are their own drawings, of course, which they did after the survey, and also detailed isometric drawings they did of old Montreal city blocks, which are particularly beautiful. And one of my favorite pieces of archival items in her archives there are these pouches of old photo negatives, which I like to think that she closed them in the late 50s, early 60s, and we opened them over 6 years later. And so these are serial photos of Saint-Jacques Street that Blanche and Sandy took of all the building facades on Saint-Jacques to really show what kind of architecture was at stake by risk of demolition in old Montreal. So eventually the city agreed to Blanche and Sandy's report, and Old Montreal was saved. So this is her immense contribution to the preservation of such a historical part of the city. And in such a project that she did relatively at the beginning of her career, we see this really wonderful and intelligent way of combining architecture and urban planning and conservation with real care and confrontational analysis in line with her principles as an architect, and an inventive solution by the end. So I think the very extensive range of her later work and career too shows this kind of consistency, design as an attitude of continuous ethical engagement with the city.
So in 1981, while she was still the dean, she contacted the Institute for Urban Design in New York to organize the fourth International Conference on Urban Design, which was going to be held in October 1982. So she already stepped down when it actually happened as a dean, but she was very much involved, of course. And what you see in these papers, and that I like a lot, that you kind of see, you can kind of reconstruct how it came about. One of the nicest surprises in this small mass of paper is the correspondence of Blanche with the National Ballet of Canada, because she wanted to organize a ballet for the conference as a kind of let's say, festive ending for the conference. She asked them if they could do a ballet for two people on the kinetic city or urban environments. And they were very interested to do this. So you see back and forth the correspondence between her and the ballet, the National Ballet of Canada. And you see also the correspondence about what it was going to cost, $15,000. I don't think it happened, and purely because of financial reasons. But in a way it happened because it is part of this archive. So you can imagine that there was a ballet, even if there wasn't. I think that's very beautiful of the collection of these papers and the fact that she kept those.
There was a dinner attended by David Cronenberg and Margaret Atwood and various very articulate people, and I had invited Blanche, and it was culture. And of course we were largely talking about the high arts. So Blanche, when Blanche's turn came to speak, she said something that I think was key to who she is. She said to the others, for me, culture is not just the high arts. Culture, we were at a table and we were eating, and she said, culture is the knife and fork you're using. Culture is the plate you're using. Culture is the texture of life. And that was Blanche. The texture of life, but played with such care and meticulous discretion. And we were so touched and impressed with that.
And here we have an example of a woman who led, but maybe was personifying the best of what we are as a community. And we get to celebrate that through her. And what better way to do it than through a person like Blanche Van Ginkel. One other thing that I find really interesting for me as a child of immigrants, my parents came from South Korea in 1968. I came along a couple of years later. I don't have a real oral connection with my grandparents. They've since passed, and I got great stories from them. But maybe I wondered the other day, someone like Blanche, who is like someone from my grandparents' generation, I got to sit down and hunker down and get all these stories from her, as if she might have been something like a grandmother figure to me. And I don't think that's a stretch to say that that mattered to her as well. I think there are times where we need to get that double generation spread to be able to kind of really hear those stories. And I wonder if that's going to impact me, as I want to tell stories not for the people just after me in terms of age, but those that are a generation or so after me. I think therein lies the real truths about what it takes to make architecture last. And so it's more than just bricks and mortar. It's more than just the great spaces, the public and the private spaces that we all try to craft, but it's the way we engage them and the way we cultivate the people and the culture within it to last. And that's something that Blanche truly, whether she knew it or not, truly was a crafts person at the highest level.